Okay, this is the online review for the government final. So we're going to start and go through these. I'm going to highlight them as I talk about them so you know which word I'm talking about. Um, and some of them will take a little longer because sometimes a couple of them have a couple of different questions over it. So the first one is double jeopardy. Um, Basically, it's a definition question for double jeopardy. It protects a person from being tried twice for the same crime. Um, so it can't be anything like if there's more than one crime, they could be tried separately, but if it's the same crime, they cannot be tried twice for that with double jeopardy. Then we have checks and balances. Now, checks and balances is a little different because there's three different questions over that. So um, a lot of them are concept questions, like the first one talks about the legislative and the judicial branch, and it basically asks how they check each other. How does the legislative branch check the judicial branch? Um, and they can do that. The legislative can check the judicial branch by removing judges through impeachment, but the judicial branch can check the legislative branch by declaring a law unconstitutional. Now, there's another one on checks and balances, and it basically gives you a list of different concepts and says like which one is not an example of a checks and balance. So that one is you need to be looking for something that only one branch would do. So if the Congress is approving a nominee, that's two branches. So it's obviously a part of the checks and balances. If the president is vetoing a bill, then that's obviously a part of the checks and balances. Um, if the Supreme Court declares a law unconstitutional, then that's obviously a check and balance. But something that wouldn't be a check and balance is like if the president makes an executive agreement, um, if Congress makes some type of decree that doesn't involve any other branch, that would be an example of what is not the checks and balance system. Um, there's one more on checks and balances, and that is more, it kind of talks about like separation of powers a little bit more, which focuses on like how they're divided evenly, so they can't be above one or the other. All right, let's move on to the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, that's just a straight up like question that you need to know, a review question, and that is that it outlawed all forms of slavery, any type of involuntarily servitude. So it forbids all types of slavery and any involuntary servitude. The Fourth Amendment is very similar. A lot of these amendment questions are pretty straightforward. Once in a while, I'll say, "Oh, this is kind of a confusing question," and kind of give you a heads up on that one. But the Fourth Amendment one, it's pretty straightforward. Fourth Amendment stands for it forbids unreasonable search and seizure, and that's basically what it is. So the Fourth Amendment is unreasonable search and seizure. Undocumented aliens. So there's a question over that, and that's very like defining. A lot of these questions are just defining what they are, but there's so many different terms. That's where you get confused. So an undocumented alien is someone who enters the United States without formal legal procedures. Um, Someone that does not have papers. So an undocumented alien is someone who enters the United States without legal procedures or documentation. Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights is basically basic constitutional rights of the people are outlined in the Bill of Rights. That's just basically what the question stands for. It's pretty straightforward. It's our basic constitutional right. Judicial review. So judicial review, there's another question that deals with Marbury versus Madison, and that's where it came from. But this particular question that we're looking at is what is it? So judicial review is when the courts determine that government actions are unconstitutional. It could be a president, it could be Congress, but the judicial review is when they find government actions unconstitutional. All right, free exercise clause. So free exercise clause, remember there's two clauses that come for the religion portion of freedom of religion in the First Amendment right. And one is the establishment clause, not establishing any religion. The other one is called the free exercise. So free exercise gives people the right to believe whatever they choose to in matters of religion. So basically, it allows them to have any type of religion they want and believe in it. That's the free exercise clause. Another big part of the Bill of Rights thing is the right to assemble. Now, this is a little bit of a confusing question. So when we're looking at the right to assemble, there are some times where the Constitution says that we can stop the right to assemble. So the government has the right to make reasonable rules regulating assemblies when they're protecting against violence or endangerment to life. So the government has the right to make reasonable rules regulating assemblies to protect violence or endangerment of life. All right, lawful arrest. This one is something the liaison officers came in and talked about. Oops, I just underlined it. In order to have a lawful arrest, police must either have a warrant or what's the other thing that they can have? Probable cause. So, a lawful arrest, police must have a warrant or probable cause. He talked about three ways you can enter a house, but we're just kind of focusing on the arrest in this one. When we see separation of powers is more about the three branches of government. So when there is separation of powers, power is distributed among three independent branches. When there is separation of powers, power is distributed among three independent branches of government. Okay. Affirmative action. All right, so affirmative action, this question's more about why we have affirmative action. Affirmative action is because the federal government hopes to overcome past discrimination. The reason why we have affirmative action, the government hopes to overcome past discrimination. Eighth Amendment. You can't get any clearer than this. Prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Amendment process. This one can be a little bit more confusing. So the amendment process, once a Constitution amendment has been ratified, it can only be changed in one way, and that's by another amendment. So you should know that once a constitutional amendment has been made, it's ratified, meaning it's a law, it can only be changed by another amendment. The great example of that is the case of the prohibition and the illegal alcohol. It was made, a amendment with the 18th Amendment, and then the 21st Amendment switched it back. All right, equality. So in the United States, the concept of equality means every individual is entitled to receive the same treatment under law. Equality in the United States means every individual is entitled to receive the same treatment under law. Sometimes we call that due process when we're talking about government. Okay, autocracy. A government ruled by a dictator. That's pretty straightforward. Government ruled by a dictator. Okay, but there's another question that deals more with dictatorship, autocracy, and oligarchy. So it kind of asks, rather than just a definition, what is the difference between them? Um, and the difference between those is in an autocracy, a single person holds all the power, and an oligarchy, a small group of people hold the power. This is a repeat question from the first quiz over chapter 1 that we did. So the difference between an oligarchy and an autocracy is that in an autocracy, a single person holds all the power, and an oligarchy, a small group of people hold all the power. All right, Thomas Hobbes. We talked about Hobbes, we talked about Locke, and I just put a Hobbes on this quiz or test, final, whatever. Um, Hobbes said that people overall were nasty, brutish, and selfish. Hobbes said that people overall were nasty, brutish, and selfish. That's why they needed a government, because they couldn't govern themselves, because they would only work in their best interest. Number 19 comes from one of the very first things we learned about in January, and that was called a sovereign state. What makes something a country? What makes something a sovereign state? Um, so there was there was actually a worksheet. It kind of looked like a diagram, and you did some fill in the blank stuff over that, over the state. Um, and it talked about, oh, excuse me, the sovereign state has a government, it has territory, it has population, and there's like 4 different things a sovereign state has. So this question is like one of the things that it's not. So obviously, if there's something that's not one of those principles of a sovereign state, then that would be your answer. All right. Miranda versus Arizona. In Miranda versus Arizona, it mandated that law enforcement officers inform persons under arrest of their constitutional rights. It mandates that law enforcement officers inform persons under arrest their constitutional rights. It's basically a definition, honestly. Eminent domain. It's a definition question again. The concept of practice of government acquisition of private property for public use. The concept or the practice of government acquisition of private property for public use. Basically, the government takes land, private property, and uses it for public use. It's called eminent domain. I talked about that in chapter 1 or unit 1. Malver versus Madison is the landmark Supreme Court case that established the concept of judicial review. So it's the landmark Supreme Court case that established the concept of judicial review. Okay, I don't see that. Looks like I might have missed one here on the test. You should add to your test right here between 22 and 23 the term Brady Bill. So add to your review between 22 and 23 the term Brady Bill. It's a gun control measure passed in 1996. It calls for a waiting period before you can purchase a handgun. So the Brady Bill is a gun control measure that calls for a waiting period before you can purchase a gun. All right, number 23, clear and present danger. So clear and present danger is a Supreme Court ruling in regard to freedom of speech that may be suppressed if there's a possibility of violence. Clear and present danger deals with a Supreme Court ruling in regard to freedom of speech. It may be suppressed if there's a possibility for violence. Number 24, injunction. An injunction, this is a very straightforward definition question. Courts may impose an injunction to prevent presentation or publication of dangerous speeches. Courts can use an injunction to prevent presentation or publications of dangerous speeches. We'll stop on 24 for this video.